The cripple who had begged outside St. Michael's Cathedral in Owerri for 11 years was carried away in an ambulance on a Sunday morning, and it was only after the doctors cut off his filthy shirt to treat him that a nurse found a small wooden cross tucked against his chest. The same wooden cross the bishop's late father had carved with his own hands 40 years ago, a cross the bishop believed had been buried with his brother's body decades before he ever became a man of God. Stay close, because before this story ends, a bishop is going to walk into a hospital ward and come face to face with a dead man who never actually died. And if stories like this grip you the way they should, tap subscribe now, because this one only gets heavier from here. Bishop Chukwuemeka Obi had walked past that beggar almost every single Sunday for 11 years without once truly looking at him. That is the terrible, ordinary truth this story insists you sit with before anything else. Not because the bishop was cruel, but because that is what happens when grief hardens into distance, when a man builds an entire life around forgetting someone so thoroughly that even when the truth is limping past him every week dressed in rags, he cannot see it. The beggar sat on the same worn stretch of pavement outside the cathedral's iron gate, legs twisted beneath him at an angle that spoke of an old, badly healed injury, palm out, voice hoarse from decades of asking strangers for kindness. The congregation called him Cripple Obi. Nobody in Owerri remembered his full name anymore, least of all the man who used to call him brother. To understand how a bishop could walk past his own blood for 11 years, you have to go back nearly 40 years to a small compound in Owerri where two boys grew up sharing one mat, one bowl of gari in lean seasons, and one father who loved them with the fierce, plain love of a man who had nothing else to give. Their father, Papa Nnamdi, was a modest trader who sold thread and cloth in Owerri's central market. He was not a wealthy man, but he was proud, and he was honest, and he raised his two sons, Obiora, the elder, sharp-tongued and quick-witted, and Emeka, the younger, quiet and thoughtful, always found with his nose in whatever book he could borrow from the mission school, to believe that honesty mattered more than comfort. Their mother, Mama Adeze, died of fever when Emeka was only 6 years old, and 2 years later, Papa Nnamdi followed her, worn down by illness and grief he never fully spoke of. He left behind two boys, Obiora, 14, and Emeka, 8, and a small parcel of land that was, in the end, the only inheritance he had to give them. That land should have been simple. It should have passed in time to the two brothers equally, as their father intended, written plainly in the presence of village elders before he died. But land in a country like theirs is rarely simple when there is a man nearby hungry enough to want it for himself. And Papa Nnamdi had exactly such a man in his own family, Uncle Okonkwo. Uncle Okonkwo had never been a poor man's brother by nature. He resented, quietly, for years, that Nnamdi's small trade had earned him a piece of land in Owerri, in a growing part of Owerri, while his own ventures, a string of failed businesses, each one blamed on bad luck rather than bad judgment, left him scraping for respect in a community that increasingly saw him as unreliable. When Nnamdi died, custom demanded Okonkwo take in his brother's orphaned sons. He did so publicly, generously, weeping convincingly at the funeral, praised by the whole compound for family loyalty. Privately, within a month, he had already begun forging the paperwork to claim the land as his own on the grounds that he was the rightful guardian of their late brother's estate until they came of age, a technicality that, handled quietly enough, could become permanent long before either boy grew old enough to challenge it. The land itself was not large by the standards of wealthy families, but it sat along a road that had, in the years just before Papa Nnamdi's death, begun to attract the attention of developers building new shops and warehouses to serve Owerri's growing trade routes. What had once been an unremarkable family plot had quietly become valuable, and Papa Nnamdi, ill and increasingly tired in his final months, trusted his younger brother to help him understand the paperwork visiting officials brought, never suspecting that the same brother was already learning from those very officials exactly how much the land could fetch if it changed hands cleanly enough. Obiora, even at 14, was not a boy who missed things. He noticed the strange visitors who came to the compound late at night to speak with his uncle in hushed voices. He noticed the surveyor who measured their father's land without explaining why. He noticed that his uncle had begun to refer to the property in careless, unguarded moments as my land rather than your father's land. And, being 14, being angry, and being his father's son through and through, he did the one thing that terrified Okonkwo more than anything else. He told the elders.
He did not have proof yet. He was only a boy repeating suspicions. But suspicions spoken aloud in a small community travel fast. And elders who respect a dead man's memory tend to ask uncomfortable questions when his orphaned son voices concern about his estate. Okonkwo was summoned before the compound council within the week, forced to explain paperwork he had not expected anyone to question so soon. He answered smoothly enough to avoid immediate accusation, but the elder's scrutiny remained, a slow fire he now had to manage, and he understood with cold clarity that as long as Obiora lived in that house, watching him, asking questions, whispering to elders, his plan would never be safe. He decided, in the quiet, calculating way of a man who has already convinced himself he is the victim of his own circumstances, that the problem was not the land and not the elders. The problem was Obiora. The accident happened on a rainy night during the Hamatan's brief retreat, the kind of heavy unseasonal rain that turns Owerri's red earth into slick mud within minutes. Okonkwo told Obiora that evening that a trader owed their late father money and had finally agreed to repay it, but only that night, only at a compound on the far edge of town, and only if Obiora came personally to collect it, since Okonkwo's leg had been troubling him. It was, of course, a lie built entirely to place a 14-year-old boy alone on a dangerous stretch of road in heavy rain and failing lights. What exactly happened on that road, only Okonkwo ever fully knew for certain, and he carried the true details of that night like a stone in his chest for the next 40 decades. What is known is this. Obiora was found the next morning at the bottom of a steep gully beside the road, both legs shattered, barely alive, having apparently slipped in the mud and fallen a considerable distance in the dark. Whether he slipped on his own or whether a hand helped him along that fall is a question this story will answer later, but sit with the uncertainty for now, because Obiora himself would spend the next 40 years unable to answer it with full confidence either. Obiora remembered, in fragments that never quite assembled into a complete picture, no matter how many times he turned them over during long sleepless nights on the street, a shape moving behind him on the road, just before he fell. A figure he told himself for years must have simply been another traveler caught in the same storm, because the alternative, that his own uncle had followed him out into the rain, was too monstrous for a 14-year-old boy to hold on to without losing his mind entirely. He remembered a hand at his shoulder, or thought he did, though fever and pain in the days afterward blurred the memory until he could no longer trust it. He chose, eventually, to not examine it too closely, because a boy trying to survive cannot afford to spend his strength on a truth he has no power to act on anyway. Okonkwo, for his part, told himself for years that he had only meant to frighten the boy,
to give him a shove that would knock him down in the mud and teach him a lesson about minding his own business, and that the gully, the darkness, the full extent of the fall were simply bad luck layered on top of a smaller cruelty he had intended. It was the kind of lie a man tells himself so many times that it eventually feels indistinguishable from memory, and it would take 40 years and a failing heart to finally crack that lie open. He survived. But the local healer and later a doctor from the mission hospital agreed that his legs would never properly support him again. He would walk, if at all, only with great difficulty and likely only with the aid of crutches for the rest of his life. For Okonkwo, this was not the tragedy the rest of the compound believed it to be. It was, however, cruelly an opportunity. He could not simply abandon a crippled 14-year-old boy without inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny he had spent weeks avoiding. Instead, he did something far colder, far more calculated. He waited until Obiora had healed enough to travel, though not nearly enough to properly care for himself, and he told the compound, with tears that had become disturbingly easy for him to produce on command, that Obiora's spirit had broken after the accident, that the boy, ashamed of his condition, had run away one night rather than live as a cripple in the town where he'd once run freely, and that despite searching, Okonkwo could not find him. It was, of course, another lie. Okonkwo personally arranged for
Alone, never guessing it came instead from a wound he didn't know he still carried. The memory of a crippled brother he believed had chosen shame and exile over staying to be loved. If you are wondering how two brothers could live in the same country for 40 years, one begging outside a cathedral, the other presiding over it, without ever recognizing each other, stay with me, because the answer is not simple coincidence. It is the specific cruelty of what disability, poverty, and time can do to a face, and the specific cruelty of what guilt and grief can do to a mind, determined not to look too closely at pain it has already decided to bury. Obiora had changed almost beyond recognition. 40 years of malnutrition, exposure, untreated infections in his damaged legs, and the particular hardness that street life carves into a face had transformed the sharp-eyed, quick-tongued boy Emeka remembered into a stooped, weathered old man whose features seemed to have been rearranged by suffering itself. He no longer walked, even with crutches, having lost what little strength remained in his legs over the decades. He moved instead in a low wooden cart with worn wheels, pushing himself along with calloused palms, positioned each Sunday just outside St. Michael's Cathedral's iron gate, where the congregation's guilt and generosity after Mass reliably produced better alms than any market corner in the city. Bishop Chukwuemeka had in fact given alms to Cripple Obi personally on dozens of occasions over the years, always with the same absent-minded kindness he showed every beggar at his gate, never once lingering long enough to truly study the man's face, never once imagining that the ruined features before him had anything to do with the brother he mourned in a completely different city, at a completely different age, in a memory frozen at 14 years old rather than aged 52. But something shifted 3 months before the ambulance came. Something small, almost imperceptible, the kind of detail that only matters in hindsight. A young church volunteer named Ngozi, who ran the cathedral's outreach ministry for Enugu's homeless and disabled, had taken a particular interest in Cripple Obi over the past year. Ngozi herself had grown up without a father, raised by a mother who cleaned houses across the city to keep her in school, And something about the old beggar's quiet dignity, the way he never grabbed at coins the way some of the more desperate men at the gate did, the way he always murmured a genuine blessing rather than a rehearsed one, had drawn her back to his corner of the pavement again and again, long after her official volunteer hours ended for the day. She brought him food beyond the usual Sunday alms, sat with him sometimes on quiet weekday afternoons, and slowly, patiently, earned enough of his trust that he began, in fragments, to speak of his past. Never the full truth, never his real name, never the specifics of Owerri or Konkwo, because 40 years of a threat whispered into a 14-year-old's ear does not simply evaporate with age. But he spoke, sometimes, of having had a little brother once, a brother he loved fiercely, a brother, he told her one afternoon, staring at nothing, who is probably a big man of God somewhere now, if life was kind to him the way it should have been. Ngozi thought little of it at the time. Many lonely old men invent comforting stories about lost family, and she had learnt not to press where street survivors clearly did not wish to be pressed. But she remembered it. She remembered it especially on the Sunday morning, 3 months later, when Cripple Obi collapsed outside the cathedral gate during the early service, his body finally giving out after decades of untreated illness and hard living. And in the chaos of getting him into an ambulance, his ragged shirt tore open, revealing the small wooden cross he had capped against his chest, hidden beneath layers of cloth for 40 years. Ngozi saw it, and something about it, the careful, old-fashioned craftsmanship, so different from the mass-produced crosses sold cheaply in every market stall in Enugu, made her hold on to the detail rather than dismiss it, the same instinct that had made her hold on to his words about a lost brother months before. She rode with him to the hospital. Here is where the story splits into two threads racing towards each other, and you need to watch both closely because neither man knew yet how close they were to colliding. In the hospital, Obiora drifted in and out of a fever brought on by a long untreated infection in his crippled legs, finally turned dangerous after years of neglect and hard living. And in his delirium, he began speaking names the nurses didn't recognize: Papa Nnamdi, Mama Adeze, and one name repeated over and over with a desperation that unsettled everyone in the ward. Emeka. Emeka, forgive me. Emeka, I never left you. Emeka. Ngozi, sitting beside his bed through the long afternoon, felt a chill she couldn't quite explain settle over her. Bishop Chukwuemeka. Everyone in Enugu called him simply Bishop Emeka in casual conversation. It could be coincidence. Emeka was not an unusual name in Igbo families. But combined with the wooden cross, combined with months of half-finished stories about a lost brother who might be a big man of God, the coincidence felt suddenly too large to ignore. Meanwhile, across the city, at almost exactly the same hour, Bishop Chukwuemeka received a call that would have seemed on any other day entirely unrelated to a dying beggar in a hospital ward. A call from a hospice in Owerri, informing him that his uncle, Okonkwo, now 81 years old and gravely ill with the failing heart that had plagued him for years, had been asking urgently, repeatedly, for the bishop to come hear his final confession before he died. Bishop Chukwuemeka had not seen his uncle in almost 15 years, their relationship growing distant and formal as the bishop's ecclesiastical duties expanded and Okonkwo's health declined into a quiet, increasingly reclusive old age. He agreed to travel to Owerri that same evening, moved by the simple human duty of a priest called to a dying man's bedside, with no idea that his uncle's confession and a crippled beggar's fevered ramblings were about to converge on the exact same 40-year-old secret from two completely different directions. If this is the part of the story where you feel your stomach tighten a little, good. That means it's working. Stay with me,
because whether the truth reaches the bishop through his dying uncle's guilt or through a beggar's fevered whispers first is about to determine whether these two brothers finally recognize each other in time or whether death claims the truth before it can be spoken aloud. And if you want to know how this collision actually plays out, don't scroll away now. Subscribe, because the next part of this story is where everything comes apart. Bishop Chukwuemeka arrived at the small private hospice in Owerri just after nightfall, still in his traveling cassock, tired from the drive but composed in the calm, practiced way decades of pastoral visits to the dying had trained into him. He found his uncle Okonkwo far frailer than he remembered, the once broad-shouldered, confident man reduced to a thin shape beneath hospital sheets, his breathing labored, his eyes sunken but sharp with a fear that had nothing to do with physical pain. "Emeka," Okonkwo rasped, gripping his nephew's hand with surprising strength for a dying man. "I need to confess something before God takes me. Something I have carried for 40 years.
Bishop Chukwuemeka settled into the chair beside the bed, folding his hands in the familiar posture of a priest prepared to receive confession, expecting perhaps old business dealings, minor sins, the ordinary regrets of an ordinary life drawing to its close. He was not prepared for what came next. Okonkwo's hand tightened further, and for a moment the old man seemed to struggle with whether he could actually force the words out at all, his breathing growing more ragged, the machine beside his bed beeping a fraction faster. "Do you remember?" he began instead, sidestepping toward the confession, the way a frightened man circles a fire before finally stepping into it. "Do you remember the night Obiora fell into the gully? You were only 8. You cried for a week." "I remember," Bishop Chukwuemeka said carefully, sensing already, in some instinctive priestly way, that this was not going to be an ordinary confession about petty theft or old grudges. "I remember you told me it was an accident, that the rain took him." "Your brother," Okonkwo whispered, tears finally slipping from eyes that had learned to produce them convincingly decades ago, though this time, for the first time in 40 years, they were entirely real. "Do you remember," he began instead, sidestepping toward the confession the way a frightened man circles a fire before finally stepping into it. "Your brother, Obiora, did not run away from you. I sent him away. I had him crippled. No, listen to me, Emeka, listen. I do not know if I pushed him myself that night or if he truly fell. My memory of that terrible hour has never been honest even with myself. But I know I chose the road. I know I chose the storm. I know I chose to send a 14-year-old boy alone into danger because he threatened to expose what I had done to your father's land. And when he survived, crippled, I sent him away to Onitsha and threatened him, told him if he ever returned or spoke the truth, I would harm you. He kept that silence for 40 years to protect you, Emeka. He is not dead. He may still be alive somewhere, begging on some street, believing to this day that his silence is the only thing keeping you safe." Bishop Chukwuemeka sat frozen, the priest's composure he had built over decades cracking apart in real time, his mind refusing at first to fully process what his uncle was confessing. "You are lying," he managed, finally, his voice shaking in a way the congregation of St. Michael's had never once heard from their steady, gentle bishop. "You told me he ran away. You told the whole compound he ran away out of shame." "I lied," Okonkwo said, his grip tightening desperately on his nephew's hand, as though physical contact could somehow lessen the weight of what he was admitting. "I lied to protect the land, and then I lied every year after,
because admitting the truth even once would have unraveled everything I built on top of that first lie. I am dying, Emeka. I cannot carry this into whatever comes after. Forgive me or don't, but find him. If he is still alive, find your brother. Bishop Chukwuemeka rose from the chair on legs that did not feel entirely steady. 40 years of grief he had structured an entire life around, suddenly revealed to be built on a foundation of lies. And in that moment, standing in a dim hospice room in Owerri, his phone rang. It was Ngozi, calling from the hospital in Enugu, her voice tight with an urgency she was struggling to explain rationally even to herself. Bishop, forgive me for calling so late, but the beggar, Cripple Obi, the one who sits outside the cathedral gate, he's very ill, and in his fever he keeps calling out your name, your actual name, Bishop, Emeka, and he was carrying a small wooden cross, very old, very carefully made, and I don't know why, but something told me I needed to call you before I said anything to anyone else. Bishop Chukwuemeka stood completely still in that hospice hallway, his uncle's confession still ringing in his ears, and understood with absolute bone-deep certainty exactly what Ngozi's phone call meant, exactly what 40 years of an unrecognized face outside his own cathedral gate had actually been. He did not sleep that night. He drove back to Enugu through the darkness with a speed that frightened even himself, praying the entire way with a desperation he had not felt since he was a grieving 8-year-old boy. Praying, not for forgiveness this time, but simply that he would arrive before it was too late. He reached the hospital just before dawn. Ngozi met him in the corridor outside the ward, her face pale with exhaustion and the strange gravity of what she suspected but could not yet confirm. He's stable, she told him quickly. The fever broke an hour ago. He's sleeping now. Bishop, I don't know what any of this means, but take me to him, Bishop Chukwuemeka said, and something in his voice made Ngozi simply nod and lead the way without another question. The old man in the hospital bed looked, at first glance, like any of 100 forgotten strangers the bishop had prayed over decades of hospital visits. Thin, weathered, marked by a lifetime of hardship the bishop's own comfortable path had spared him. But as Bishop Chukwuemeka stepped closer, close enough to truly look, close enough for the first time in 11 years of walking past this exact face at his own cathedral gate, something in the shape of the old man's jaw, the particular arch of his eyebrows, even beneath decades of weathering, stirred a memory buried so deep the bishop had stopped believing it was real. The old man's eyes fluttered open. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The old beggar's gaze moved slowly across the bishop's face, the fine cassock, the pectoral cross, the dignity that 40 years and an entire ecclesiastical career had built onto features that once belonged to a grieving 8-year-old boy. And in his weathered face, something began, slowly, painfully, to crumble. "Emeka," he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with disbelief he had not allowed himself in 40 years. "Emeka," Obiora said, and the name broke apart in his throat as he said it, decades of careful priestly composure dissolving entirely as he sank to his knees beside the hospital bed, gripping his brother's calloused, ruined hand in both of his own. "Obiora, it's you. God forgive me, it's really you." What followed was not the clean, tidy reunion of a folktale ending, and this story owes you the truth of that, because real grief does not resolve in a single embrace. Obiora wept, but not only from joy. He wept from 40 years of a silence he had carried, believing it protected the only family he had left, only to learn in a single hospital room that the protection had never been necessary, that his suffering had bought nothing, that Okonkwo's threat had been hollow from the very beginning, sustained by nothing but his own fear.
And Bishop Chukwuemeka wept not only from joy either, but from the specific, suffocating guilt of a man who realized he had walked past his own brother's face at his own cathedral gate 11 years, distributed alms to him for 11 years.
With the same distracted kindness he showed every stranger, and never once looked closely enough to see what should have been unmistakable. "I gave you coins," the bishop said brokenly, still kneeling beside the bed. "Every Sunday, sometimes I gave you coins and never once truly looked at you. Forgive me, Obiora. Forgive me for not seeing you." "You were a boy who believed his brother abandoned him," Obiora said quietly, his voice hoarse but steadying now. "Why would you have looked for a dead man's face on a beggar's shoulders? I chose silence to protect you. I do not blame you for a grief neither of us chose." Ngozi stood quietly near the door through all of this, tears running freely down her own face, feeling the strange, humbling weight of having been the small, almost accidental thread that pulled an entire 40-year knot loose. She would think, in the years that followed, about how close the truth had come to staying buried forever. How easily she might have dismissed his fevered words as meaningless delirium. How easily the wooden cross might have gone unnoticed beneath torn cloth. How easily a bishop, already exhausted from an overnight drive, might have simply gone home to sleep, rather than rushing straight to a hospital ward on nothing more than a volunteer's uncertain hunch. She never spoke of it as her own achievement, though. Whenever the story was retold in later years, she insisted the credit belonged to an old man's stubborn, buried love for a brother he had never stopped protecting, even when protection was no longer needed. The land, it turned out, upon investigation, had been quietly resold decades ago through a chain of transactions Okonkwo had structured to be nearly untraceable, the profits long since spent or lost to his own failed ventures over the years. There was no fortune waiting to be reclaimed, nor dramatic restoration of stolen wealth. What Obiora recovered was not property. It was simply, finally, his name, his brother, and a place in a family he had spent 40 years believing he'd lost through his own supposed cowardice. Bishop Chukwuemeka moved his brother into the cathedral rectory himself, refusing every suggestion that Obiora be cared for elsewhere, and spent the following 2 years, for Obiora's damaged health, worn down by decades of hardship, did not allow for many more than that, learning slowly and imperfectly how to be a brother again after 40 years of separation neither of them had chosen. Obiora never fully regained the use of his legs, never stopped needing his low wooden cart to move through the rectory gardens he came to love in his final years. But he stopped begging, stopped sleeping in doorways, stopped being a nameless fixture at a gate he once believed was the closest he would ever come to home, without ever knowing it already was. When Obiora died, 2 years after that hospital reunion, Bishop Chukwuemeka buried him not quietly, not in some forgotten corner reserved for the poor, but with the full dignity of a funeral mass at St. Michael's Cathedral itself, before a congregation that had walked past this same man at the gate for over a decade without ever knowing his name. The bishop spoke at that funeral, not the polished words of a churchman comforting grieving strangers, but the raw, unguarded words of a brother finally allowed to grieve properly, telling the entire congregation the full truth of who Cripple Obi had actually been, a boy who lost everything at 14 to protect a brother who never needed protecting, and who forgave in the end a world that had taken 40 years to finally see him. The congregation wept that day in a way St. Michael's had rarely witnessed, not the polite, restrained grief of a formal funeral mass, but something rawer, because many of them realized, sitting in those pews, that they too had dropped coins into Cripple Obi's palm for years, without ever once asking his name, without ever once wondering what story had left a man folded in a wooden cart outside their gate
for over a decade. An old market woman near the back stood up unprompted during the bishop's eulogy and confessed through tears that she sometimes walked past him without giving anything at all when her own week had been hard, and she asked God's forgiveness for every Sunday she had been too tired to see a human being where their gate was.
She had trained herself to see only an inconvenience. The bishop did not rebuke her. He simply nodded, because he understood better than anyone in that cathedral exactly what she meant. Bishop Chukwuemeka never walked past a beggar at his gate again without stopping to truly look at their face. He built, in the years that followed, a proper shelter and clinic beside the cathedral for Enugu's homeless and disabled, named simply for his brother, and made it his personal practice every single week for the rest of his ministry to sit and speak with each person who came seeking alms at his gate, not out of guilt alone, though guilt remained a quiet companion in him until his own final days, but because he had learned, in the most painful way a man can learn anything, that the person you walk past without truly seeing might be the exact truth that could break your heart open, if only you had stopped long enough to look. That is the story of the cripple who begged outside a cathedral for 11 years, and the bishop who gave him coins every Sunday without once recognizing his own blood. A story about how the people we love most can become strangers to us, not through distance or death, but through the simple human failure of never looking closely enough, and how the truth, buried deep enough for long enough, still finds its way home in the end, even if it takes 40 years and a dying man's confession to get there. If this story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the family we lose without knowing it, the truths we walk past every single day, and the reunions that arrive far later than they should, but arrive nonetheless. I'll see you in the next one. Like and subscribe for more video like this. God bless you all.